The fluorescent lights of the downtown law office buzzed with a sound that made Sarah Chen's headache worse. She shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor as she tried to find a position that didn't make her back ache. Around her, strangers in expensive suits checked their phones and whispered to one another, their designer handbags worth more than Sarah's rent for 3 months. She didn't belong here. That much was obvious from the way the receptionist had looked at her when she'd arrived, taking in her faded jeans, the clearance rack blouse with its missing button hidden under her cardigan. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The canvas tote bag she'd been carrying since college. Sarah had almost turned around and left, but the certified letter in her purse had been insistent. The estate of Margaret Louise Whitmore requires your presence. Margaret Whitmore. Sarah barely remembered her. A distant great-aunt she'd met, maybe twice as a child. An elderly woman with sharp eyes and silver hair who'd attended a family reunion decades ago. They'd exchanged Christmas cards for a while, but even that had tapered off after Sarah's mother died. She had no idea why she was here, why she'd been summoned to this gleaming tower of glass and marble when she should be out looking for work. 3 months ago, she'd been a graphic designer at a small marketing firm. Stable income, benefits, a future that felt manageable if not exciting. Then the company had been acquired, and Sarah had been part of the restructuring. The severance had lasted 6 weeks. Her savings account, already thin from helping her younger brother through rehab, had evaporated like morning dew. Now she was 32 years old, unemployed, and exactly 17 days away from eviction. The notice was taped to her apartment door, its stark black letters a daily reminder of her failure. She'd applied to 43 jobs in the past month. She'd gotten 2 interviews and 0 offers. Her landlord had stopped returning her calls. Sarah Chen, a young man in a crisp navy suit, appeared in the doorway, his smile professionally warm. "Mr. Whitmore will see you now." Sarah stood, smoothing her cardigan nervously, and followed him down a corridor lined with oil paintings and dark wood paneling. The conference room at the end was larger than her entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a table that could seat 20 people. Only 4 chairs were occupied. At the head of the table sat an elderly attorney with wire-rimmed glasses and a manila folder, thick with documents. To his right, a middle-aged couple, the woman in pearls, the man in a grey suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car. To his left, another man, younger, with slicked-back hair and a Rolex that caught the light. "Ah, Miss Chen," the attorney said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Thank you for coming. I'm Douglas Whitmore, executor of Margaret Whitmore's estate. These are her other beneficiaries, her nephew Richard and his wife Constance, and her grandson Trevor." The 3 of them looked at Sarah with expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Constance's lips pressed into a thin line. Trevor didn't bother looking up from his phone. "Now that we're all assembled," Douglas continued, opening the folder, "we can proceed with the reading of the will." Margaret was very specific about her wishes. Sarah's heart pounded. She had no idea what to expect. A small keepsake, maybe? A piece of jewelry? Surely nothing significant. She'd barely known the woman. Douglas began to read, his voice steady and measured. The bulk of Margaret's estate was substantial. A townhouse in the historic district, investment portfolios, antique furniture, jewelry collected over 8 decades. Richard received the house and most of the financial assets. Constance got the jewelry collection. Trevor was granted the vintage car collection and remaining investment accounts. With each bequest, Sarah sank lower in her chair. Of course, she was the poor relation, the afterthought. She'd been called here out of politeness, nothing more. Then Douglas turned to the final page, and his expression shifted slightly. "And finally, to my great-niece Sarah Chen, who showed me kindness when others forgot, I leave the contents of storage unit number 247, at Secure Lock Storage on Industrial Boulevard. Paid in full for the next 6 months. Silence filled the room. Sarah blinked, confused. A storage unit? Trevor laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. A storage unit? That's it? That's hilarious. Really, Douglas, Constance said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Couldn't Aunt Margaret have left the girl something useful? Some cash, at least. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking. What's even in there? Aunt Margaret's old newspapers? Moth-eaten clothes? He turned to Sarah with exaggerated concern. I hope you have a truck, dear. You'll need it to haul away all that junk. Douglas cleared his throat. The contents of the unit are yours to claim, Miss Chen. Here's the key and the facility information. He slid an envelope across the polished table. I should mention that Margaret was quite deliberate about this bequest. She specifically requested that you, and only you, receive access to Unit 247. Sarah reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single brass key and a printed document with the storage facility's address. That was it. No explanation, no note. Nothing to indicate why Margaret had left her this instead of anything of actual value. Well, Trevor said, standing and stretching. Guess we know who the favorite wasn't. He glanced at Sarah with undisguised contempt. Better hope there's something sellable in there, sweetheart. You look like you could use the money. Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. She wanted to snap back, to defend herself. But what could she say? He was right. She looked exactly like what she was, broke, desperate, and running out of options. The meeting concluded quickly after that. Richard and Constance gathered their paperwork, discussing plans to list the townhouse and liquidate assets. Trevor was already on his phone, presumably telling someone about his inheritance. None of them looked at Sarah as they left. Douglas walked her to the elevator, his expression sympathetic. I'm sorry that wasn't more substantial, he said quietly. But Margaret was adamant. She said, you'd understand when the time came. Understand what? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm afraid she didn't specify. The elevator doors opened. The storage unit is yours, Miss Chen. Whatever's inside, it's legally your property. The rental is paid through December. But after that, he trailed off meaningfully. Sarah stepped into the elevator, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the polished brass, pale face. Dark, circles under her eyes, shoulders slumped with exhaustion and disappointment. A storage unit. Her great-aunt had left her a storage unit. She made it to her car before the tears came, hot and angry, and laced with the bitter taste of humiliation. Through the blur, she pulled out her phone and searched for Secure Lock Storage. The facility was on the industrial edge of town, surrounded by warehouses and auto body shops. The reviews were mixed. Clean enough, one said. Wouldn't leave anything valuable here, warned another. What was she supposed to do with this? She could barely afford gas to drive across town, let alone whatever fees might be involved in clearing out someone else's junk. And then what? Haul it all to the dump? Try to sell moth-eaten furniture at a garage sale. Sarah rested her forehead against the steering wheel, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. The eviction notice, the empty bank account, the job applications that disappeared into the void, and, now this a final, cosmic joke at her expense. But as she sat there in the parking garage, something else stirred beneath the despair. A memory, faint and distant, of Margaret at that long-ago family reunion. The old woman had found Sarah sitting alone under a tree, reading a book while the adults argued about politics and money. Margaret had settled beside her, not saying anything at first, just watching the clouds drift overhead. Finally, she'd spoken. Your mother tells me you're an artist. Sarah had been 15, awkward and uncertain. I like to draw. Good, Margaret had said firmly. Don't let them talk you out of it. The practical people always think they know best, but they're the ones who end up with the least interesting lives. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. She'd patted Sarah's hand. Remember, child, the most valuable things are often the ones nobody else wants. The memory felt significant now, though Sarah couldn't say why. Margaret had been different from the rest of the family. Quieter, more observant, less concerned with status and appearances. She'd lived alone in her townhouse, volunteered at the library, traveled to strange places well into her 80s. She'd never married, never had children, and from what Sarah remembered, she'd seemed perfectly content with that choice. Would a woman like that really leave her great niece a storage unit full of worthless junk? Sarah lifted her head, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She had nothing else. No job prospects, no money, no options. The very least she could do was see what Margaret had left her. Maybe there would be something she could sell, something to buy herself another month in the apartment. It wasn't hope, exactly, but it was something to do besides sitting here drowning in self-pity. She started the car, programming the storage facility's address into her phone. The route would take her 40 minutes in current traffic. As she pulled out of the parking garage into the bright afternoon sunlight, she glanced at the envelope on the passenger seat. Unit 247, 6 months paid, and a key that felt strangely heavy in her pocket, as though it carried more weight than mere brass should. The drive across town took Sarah through neighborhoods she rarely visited. The gleaming downtown towers gave way to older commercial districts. Then industrial parks with chain-link fences and loading docks. Secure lock storage sat on a corner lot. A sprawling complex of orange metal buildings surrounded by razor wire and security cameras. The office was a small prefab structure near the entrance, its windows plastered with signs advertising climate-controlled units and 24/7 access. Sarah parked in the nearly empty lot and walked inside, the key clutched in her sweaty palm. A bored-looking young man sat behind the counter, barely glancing up from his phone. "Help you?" "I inherited a storage unit," Sarah said, placing the key and paperwork on the counter. "Unit 247. I need to access it." He scanned the documents, typed something into his ancient computer, and nodded. "Yeah, you're on the list. Margaret Whitmore's account, paid through December 15th. He handed her a printout. "Building C, 3rd floor. Elevator's broken, so you'll have to take the stairs. You planning to clear it out today? I just want to see what's inside first." "Yeah. Well, you got about 4 hours till we close. After that, you'll need to come back tomorrow." He pushed a clipboard toward her. "Sign in. Cart rentals are $5 if you need one." Sarah signed the form, declined the cart, and followed the maze of orange buildings until she found C. The stairwell smelled of concrete dust and old motor oil. Her footsteps echoed as she climbed to the 3rd floor, emerging into a fluorescent-lit corridor, lined with identical orange doors. Unit 247 was at the far end, tucked into a corner beside a flickering light. The door was standard-issue metal, secured with a heavy padlock. Sarah's hands trembled as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, the mechanism giving way with a satisfying click. She pulled the lock free and grasped the door's handle. Pulling upward, the door rattled and resisted, then suddenly rolled upward with a metallic shriek that made her jump. Dust motes swirled in the suddenly revealed space, dancing in the fluorescent light from the hallway. Sarah stood frozen, staring into the 10 by 10 unit. It was packed floor to ceiling. Cardboard boxes, stacked in careful rows, plastic storage bins with taped lids, garment bags hanging from a portable rack, an old steamer trunk with tarnished brass fittings, an ancient filing cabinet, 4 drawers tall, with rust spots on its olive-green surface, and in the very back, covered with a white sheet, something large and rectangular. This wasn't junk hastily thrown into storage. Everything was organized, labeled, arranged with evident care. Sarah could see Margaret's handwriting on some of the boxes. Kitchen items, winter, clothes, books, poetry. She stepped inside, the air stale and thick. The first box she reached for was labeled photographs. She pulled it down carefully and opened the flap. Inside were dozens of photo albums, their covers faded but intact. She opened one at random and found herself looking at black and white images from the 1950 seconds. Margaret, as a young woman, impossibly stylish in a fitted dress and pearls, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Margaret, at a typewriter, cigarette in hand, grinning at the camera. Margaret with a group of women at what looked like a jazz club, everyone laughing. These weren't the photos of a woman who'd led a boring, forgettable life. These were the images of adventure, of friendship, of a life fully lived. Sarah set the album aside and reached for another box, this one labeled Letters Personal. Inside were bundles of envelopes tied with string, organized by decade. She pulled out one bundle from the 1960 seconds and carefully unfolded a letter. The handwriting was elegant, the paper thin and yellowed. My dearest Margaret, Paris is everything you said it would be, and more. I've found a small apartment in the 6th arrondissement, where I can write without interruption. The letters went on like this. Evidence of a rich correspondence with people from all over the world. Margaret had clearly maintained friendships across continents and decades. Sarah found herself getting lost in the words, in glimpses of a life that had seemed ordinary from the outside, but had been filled with extraordinary connections. She checked her phone. An hour had passed. She'd barely made a dent in the unit's contents. The filing cabinet called to her next. She tried the top drawer, which slid open with a metallic groan. Inside were hanging folders, each meticulously labeled. Financial records, 1980 seconds. Property deeds. Legal documents. Investment statements. Sarah's breath caught. She pulled out the folder labeled Investment Statements and opened. The most recent statement, dated just 3 months before Margaret's death, showed an account balance that made Sarah's vision blur. She blinked, counted the zeros again, and felt her knees go weak. $247,000. The account was with a small investment firm, one Sarah had never heard of. But the letterhead looked legitimate, and the statement was detailed. Stocks, bonds, dividends, reinvested over decades. Margaret had been quietly building wealth while living modestly, spending little and investing wisely. And this statement was in a folder labeled Account #3. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled out 2 more folders. Account #1, $189,000. Account #2, $312,000. Her heart hammered so hard she thought she might pass out. She sank down onto the floor, surrounded by boxes and files, staring at the papers in her hands. Margaret Whitmore had been worth $750,000 in investments alone, and she'd kept these accounts separate from her estate, hidden in a storage unit, where Richard and Constance and Trevor would never think to look. Why? Sarah pulled out the folder labeled Legal Documents and found the answer on the first page. It was a letter, dated 2 years ago, written in Margaret's careful script. To my great-niece Sarah, if you're reading this, it means you've found what I wanted you to have. Not the townhouse Richard will sell that within a month. Not the jewelry Constance will pawn it for vacation money. Not the cars Trevor will wreck them, or sell them, or both. You, my dear, were the only one who ever asked me about my life instead of my money. Do you remember that afternoon at the reunion, when you were 15? You asked me what Paris was like. You wanted to know if I'd been happy, living alone. You didn't judge me or pity me. You were just genuinely curious. That meant more to me than you can possibly know. The accounts in this filing cabinet represent a lifetime of careful saving and smart investing. I lived on very little, because I needed very little. The experiences I bought, the travel, the books, the friendships, those were worth far more than fancy cars or big houses. Now they're yours. Not because you deserve them, though you do. Not because you need them, though I suspect you might. but because I trust you to understand what wealth really means. It's not about things. It's about freedom. The freedom to choose your own path, to take risks, to be generous, to live on your own terms. Use it wisely. Use it well. And know that somewhere, somehow, I'm cheering you on. With love, Aunt Margaret. Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, before she fully believed it. Margaret had done this deliberately. She'd kept these accounts hidden, paying for this storage unit for years, waiting for the day when Sarah would need it most, and she'd needed it to be discovered only after the others had claimed their inheritance, so no one could contest it or demand a share. The storage unit, bequest, had seemed like an insult, a joke, but it had been a gift, carefully wrapped in obscurity. Sarah wiped her eyes and stood on shaky legs. There was more to see, more to discover. She moved to the garment bags and unzipped one, finding vintage clothing in perfect condition, designer pieces from the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds that would be worth thousands to the right collectors. Another box contained first edition books, their dust jackets protected by clear sleeves. A third held antique jewelry, not the flashy pieces Constance had inherited, but older, more refined treasures. The sheet-covered rectangle in the back turned out to be a painting in original oil by an artist Sarah vaguely recognized from her art history classes. She photographed the signature and searched it on her phone. Her breath caught when she saw the auction results. Similar pieces had sold for $30,000 to $50,000. Margaret hadn't just left her money. She'd left her a treasure trove, carefully curated and hidden away. Every item in this unit had been chosen with care, preserved with love, and entrusted to the one person Margaret believed would understand their value. Sarah worked through the afternoon, cataloging what she found, her mind racing with possibilities. The investment accounts alone would solve her immediate problems. The eviction notice, the empty bank account, the crushing weight of financial anxiety. But there was so much more here. Margaret's entire life, distilled into boxes and folders, paintings and letters, a legacy not of things, but of experiences and wisdom. When the facility manager's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing closing time in 15 minutes, Sarah carefully locked the unit and made her way back to her car. Her mind was spinning. She needed to contact the investment firms, verify the accounts, begin the legal process of claiming her inheritance. She'd need an attorney. Maybe Douglas Whitmore could help. But first, she needed to sit with this revelation, to let it sink in. Margaret Whitmore, a woman she'd barely known, had changed her life with a single deliberate act of generosity. As Sarah drove home through the darkening streets, she thought about that long-ago conversation under the tree. Margaret asking about her art. Margaret telling her to ignore the practical people. Margaret's words, "The most valuable things are often the ones nobody else wants." A storage unit, full of junk. That's what Richard and Trevor and Constance had assumed. And they'd never know what they'd missed. Sarah parked outside her apartment building, where the eviction notice still hung on her door like a scarlet letter. But for the first time in months, she didn't feel the crushing weight of dread when she looked at it. She had options now. She had hope. She had her great-aunt's blessing, delivered from beyond the grave in the form of a brass key and a storage unit nobody wanted. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of claiming her inheritance. Tonight, she would sleep without the gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion. As she unlocked her apartment door, she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. I understand." And somewhere, somehow, she felt certain the old woman was smiling. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn, her mind already racing with plans. She'd hardly slept, lying awake as ideas and questions tumbled through her thoughts. The investment accounts were real. She'd verified the firms online, found their professional listings, confirmed they were legitimate. But she needed to move carefully, to protect what Margaret had given her. She made coffee with the last of her grounds and sat at her tiny kitchen table with a legal pad, making lists. First, contact Douglas Whitmore about the inheritance. Second, secure a safety deposit box for the valuable documents. Third, inventory everything in the storage unit. Fourth, find a reputable appraiser for the artwork and vintage clothing. Her phone buzzed. A text from her landlord. Final notice. Payment or eviction proceedings begin Monday. Today was Thursday. She had 4 days. Sarah closed her eyes and took a breath. She could handle this. She had to. At 9 o'clock sharp, she called Douglas Whitmore's office. His secretary answered, all professional courtesy, until Sarah explained why she was calling. Then the woman's tone shifted, becoming warmer. Oh, Miss Chen. Yes. Mr. Whitmore mentioned you might reach out. Let me see if he's available. Douglas came on the line moments later. Miss Chen, I hope you've had a chance to visit the storage unit? I have, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. I found some documents I need help with. Investment accounts that weren't listed in the will. A pause. Then, I suspected Margaret might have arranged something like that. She was quite clever about keeping certain assets private. I'd be happy to help you navigate the legal aspects. Can you come to my office this afternoon? They arranged a meeting for 2 o'clock. Sarah spent the morning back at the storage unit, this time with a borrowed hand truck and determination. She carefully loaded the filing cabinet into her car, along with the painting and several boxes of the most valuable items. The storage unit manager watched with curiosity, but said nothing as she made multiple trips. You keeping the unit? He asked finally. For now, Sarah said. I'll let you know. Yeah. Well, we got a waiting list if you decide you don't need it. Just for your information. Sarah drove across town to her bank, where she rented the largest safety deposit box available. The bank manager, a thin woman with reading glasses on a chain, helped her carry in the filing cabinet. Valuable documents? She asked. Family records, Sarah said, which was true enough. She secured the investment account statements, the letter from Margaret, and several pieces of antique jewelry in the box. The rest could wait, but these essentials needed protection. If something happened, if her apartment was broken into, if her car was stolen, these documents represented her future. The meeting with Douglas Whitmore went more smoothly than she'd dared hope. He reviewed the investment statements, made copies, and nodded with evident satisfaction. These are properly documented and completely separate from Margaret's probated estate, he said. The accounts list you as the beneficiary upon her death. It's all legitimate and above board. Richard and the others have no claim to these assets. Will they find out? Sarah asked. Douglas met her eyes over his reading glasses. Not from me, and not unless you tell them. Margaret was very deliberate about this arrangement. She set these accounts up decades ago, naming you as beneficiary long before her death. As far as the law is concerned, this money was never part of her estate. Relief flooded through Sarah. What do I need to do? I'll contact these firms on your behalf. Provide the death certificate and your identification. The transfer process typically takes a few weeks, but given the circumstances. He paused, studying her. Are you in immediate financial distress, Miss Chen? Sarah's cheeks burned. I have an eviction notice. 4 days. Douglas nodded, his expression sympathetic rather than pitying. Let me make some calls. These firms have procedures for emergency distributions. I'll see what I can arrange. True to his word, by the time Sarah left his office, Douglas had contacted all 3 investment firms and expedited emergency access requests. He estimated she'd have access to at least some of the funds within 48 hours. In the meantime, he said, handing her a business card, if your landlord gives you any trouble, have them call me. I'll explain that significant assets are in the process of transfer and that you're financially solvent. Sarah's voice caught. Why are you helping me? Douglas smiled faintly. Because Margaret asked me to. And because he hesitated, then continued, "My daughter is about your age. She lost her job last year, struggled for months before finding her footing. I know how hard it can be." Consider this a professional courtesy to Margaret's memory. Sarah left his office feeling like she'd stepped through a portal into an alternate reality. 2 days ago, she'd been broke, desperate, and alone. Now she had an attorney working on her behalf, $750,000 coming her way, and a storage unit full of treasures. It felt surreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. But it was real. She had the key in her pocket to prove it. That evening, she returned to the storage unit one more time, determined to complete a full inventory before the weekend. As she worked through the boxes, she found more surprises. Stock certificates for companies that no longer existed, but which collectors might want. A complete set of vintage National Geographic magazines, pristine in their original wrappers. A box of rare vinyl records from the 1950s and 60s. Margaret had been a collector, but not a hoarder. Everything here had value, either monetary or sentimental. As Sarah worked, she began to understand her great-aunt in a way she never had in life. Margaret had been someone who appreciated beauty and quality, who invested in things that lasted, who chose experiences over status symbols. The sun was setting when Sarah finally locked the unit and headed back to her car. She was exhausted but energized, her mind already planning next steps. She'd need to catalog the vintage clothing, find buyers for some of the collectibles, determine what to keep and what to sell. But she had time now. She had resources. Her phone rang as she started the car. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press accept. "Miss Chen?" A woman's voice, professional and warm. "This is Janet Morrison from Whitmore and Associates Investment Management. Douglas Whitmore contacted us regarding your beneficiary status on account number 24701. Sarah's heart rate spiked. "Yes, that's right. I've reviewed your file, and I want to personally welcome you as a client. Margaret Whitmore was one of our longest-standing investors, and we're honored to continue serving her family. I understand you're in need of immediate funds. My landlord is threatening eviction," Sarah admitted. "I have 4 days. I've expedited an emergency distribution," Janet said. "You should see $25,000 in your checking account by tomorrow morning. That should give you some breathing room while we process the full account transfer. Once everything is complete, we'll schedule a meeting to discuss your investment strategy going forward." Sarah could barely speak. 25,000. Tomorrow. Before noon, I'd estimate. Mr. Whitmore explained your situation. We want to help. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her car in the storage facility parking lot and cried. Not from despair this time, but from overwhelming relief. She could pay her rent. She could buy groceries. She could stop the crushing daily panic of wondering how she'd survive another week. Margaret had saved her, a woman she'd barely known, who'd seen something in an awkward teenager worth remembering, worth protecting, worth enriching decades later. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too wired to sleep despite her exhaustion. Her phone sat on the nightstand, the screen dark but full of promise. By tomorrow, her entire life would be different. The eviction notice would be meaningless. The empty cabinets would be full. The weight pressing on her chest for months would finally lift. She thought about what she'd do with the money. Pay her rent, obviously. 6 months in advance, maybe, to give herself stability. Buy food, replace her failing laptop, get her car serviced properly. But beyond the immediate necessities, she had choices now. She could take time to find the right job instead of desperately grabbing whatever was available. She could invest in her art again, buy proper supplies, maybe even rent a studio space. Or she could do something bigger, something that would honor Margaret's memory. The idea came to her slowly, taking shape in the darkness. Margaret had lived modestly while building wealth specifically so she could give Sarah freedom. What if Sarah used that freedom not just for herself, but for others? She could start a foundation. Small grants for young artists facing financial hardship. Scholarships for students who needed support. A way to pass on the gift Margaret had given her. The thought made her smile. Yes, that felt right. That felt like something Margaret would approve of. Sarah's phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m., waking her from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. She grabbed it groggily, squinting at the screen. Bank alert. Deposit of $25,000 has been credited to your account. She stared at the message until it became real, until the numbers stopped looking like a mistake or a cruel joke. Then, she pulled up her banking app with trembling fingers. Current balance, $25,147.82. The 82 cents were what remained from her last paycheck. The rest was Margaret's gift, transferred overnight, like magic, like grace. Sarah got out of bed, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. She logged into her landlord's payment portal and paid not just this month's rent, but the next 6 months. The transaction went through without issue. Confirmation number appearing on her screen like a benediction. She was safe. She had a home. She had time to breathe. The eviction notice still hung on her door. Sarah walked over, peeled it off carefully, and dropped it in the recycling bin. Done. Finished. That chapter of her life was over. Over the next 3 weeks, the full scope of Margaret's gift became clear. The investment firms transferred the accounts into Sarah's name, consolidating them into a single portfolio she could manage. Douglas Whitmore helped her navigate the tax implications and set up proper trusts. The vintage clothing went to a specialized dealer who offered $17,000 for the best pieces. The painting sold at auction for $43,500, far more than Sarah had hoped. By mid-November, Sarah's net worth had increased from negative factoring in credit card debt to over $850,000. She quit applying for jobs she didn't want and started thinking seriously about what she wanted to do with her life. The answer came easier than she expected. Help others the way Margaret had helped her. She established the Margaret Whitmore Foundation for Emerging Artists, seeding it with $200,000 from her inheritance. The foundation would provide small grants, $5,000 to $10,000 to artists facing financial hardship. No complex applications, no bureaucratic hoops. Just a simple form, a portfolio review, and direct help for people who needed it. The first grants went out in January. Sarah read every application personally, looking for people who reminded her of herself, talented, hardworking, and drowning in circumstances beyond their control. She funded a single mother trying to finish art school, a disabled veteran who wanted to buy photography equipment, a recent graduate who couldn't afford supplies. Each grant came with a letter explaining Margaret's story, and Sarah's, and the importance of paying kindness forward. The response overwhelmed her. Within months, she'd received hundreds of applications, stories of struggle and creativity, of people holding on by their fingernails to their dreams. She expanded the foundation, brought on advisors, formalized the process. But she kept the core mission the same: direct help, no strings attached, for artists who needed a chance. 6 months after that meeting in Douglas Whitmore's office, Sarah stood in a small gallery downtown, surrounded by artwork created by the foundation's grant recipients. The opening night was packed: artists, donors, supporters, and the press. A local news station was doing a feature on the secret inheritance that changed lives. Sarah gave a short speech, explaining how Margaret Whitmore's hidden gift had transformed her life, and how she was committed to sharing that transformation with others. She talked about the storage unit, the key, the moment of discovery. She talked about the fear of eviction, the despair of rejection, the grinding anxiety of poverty. Margaret taught me that wealth isn't about accumulation, Sarah said. her voice carrying across the crowded room. It's about freedom, generosity, and the ability to live authentically. Every artist here tonight received a grant because Margaret believed, and I believe, that creativity matters, that beauty matters, that giving people a chance to pursue their dreams is worth more than any balance sheet. The crowd applauded. In the back, Sarah spotted Douglas Whitmore, who'd become not just her attorney but a friend and advisor to the foundation. He raised his glass in a quiet toast. After the speeches, as Sarah moved through the gallery looking at the art her grants had helped create, a young woman approached her nervously. She was thin, with paint-stained fingers and uncertain eyes. "Miss Chen, I'm Emily Torres. I received a grant last month." Sarah smiled warmly. "I remember your application. The series on urban decay and renewal. How's it going?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I was 2 weeks from eviction when your grant came through. I had $37 in my bank account. I was going to have to move back home, give up my studio, probably give up art entirely. Your grant didn't just buy me supplies and time, it bought me hope." She gestured to a series of paintings on the wall, nearby, powerful, haunting images of abandoned buildings being reclaimed by nature. "I finished the series. A gallery in Portland wants to show it. I have a commission from a private collector. None of this would exist without you." Sarah took Emily's hands. "Without Margaret," she corrected gently. "I'm just the messenger." But as she stood there, surrounded by art that existed because of Margaret's foresight and her own determination to honor that gift, Sarah understood something profound. She wasn't just a messenger. She was a link in a chain of generosity that stretched backward to Margaret and forward to every artist the foundation would help. The storage unit, that ugly, ordinary storage unit in the industrial part of town, had contained more than money and antiques. It had contained possibility, the possibility of transformation, of redemption, of lives changed through deliberate acts of kindness. Margaret had seen that possibility decades ago, when she'd met a lonely teenager who asked genuine questions. She'd nurtured it, protected it, and ultimately delivered it at precisely the moment Sarah needed it most. Now Sarah was doing the same for others, creating her own hidden treasures of opportunity and hope. Later that evening, after the gallery had emptied and Sarah was alone with her thoughts, she drove to the old storage facility. Unit 247 was empty now, its contents distributed or sold or donated. She'd kept the unit for 6 months, wanting to honor Margaret's planning, but eventually she'd let it go. Someone else needed the space. She stood in the empty corridor, looking at the orange metal door that had once guarded her future. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting the same harsh glow as that first day when she'd arrived, broke and desperate. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty air, to Margaret's memory, to the universe that had somehow conspired to save her. "Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me, for teaching me that sometimes the most valuable inheritances are the ones nobody else wants." The storage facility manager appeared at the end of the hallway, keys jangling. "You checking out for good?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, I'm done here. That unit brought you good luck, huh? I heard. What you've been doing with that foundation. Pretty cool." "It brought me more than luck," Sarah said. "It brought me purpose." As she walked out of the facility, for the last time, into the cool evening air, Sarah thought about all the storage units in the world. How many of them held forgotten treasures, overlooked possibilities, hidden gifts, waiting for someone to discover them. How many contained not just things, but the seeds of transformation. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. Another grant application. This one from a young sculptor in Detroit who needed funds to cast a series of bronze pieces. Sarah read it as she walked to her car, already knowing she'd approve it. The story was too familiar, too close to her own. The desperation, the determination, the dreams that refused to die despite impossible circumstances. She got in her car, but before starting the engine, She pulled out the brass key she still carried. She'd kept it all these months, unable to let it go. It represented everything: the moment of discovery, the transition from despair to hope, the physical manifestation of Margaret's love. Sarah held it up to the streetlight, watching it glint. Such a small thing, this key, such an ordinary piece of brass. But it had opened more than a storage unit door. It had opened her entire future. She tucked it carefully back into her pocket, started her car, and drove home through the city streets, past the neighborhoods where other people were fighting their own battles with poverty and fear and dwindling options. Some of them would find their own unexpected inheritances, their own hidden treasures. Others wouldn't be so lucky. But because of Margaret and because of Sarah, a few more people would get their chance. A few more artists would receive that knock on the door from opportunity, that moment when everything changed. The storage unit was empty now, but its impact continued to ripple outward, touching lives Margaret would never meet, creating beauty and possibility in ways the old woman could never have imagined. Sarah smiled as she pulled into her new apartment building. Not the cramped studio where she'd faced eviction, but a two-bedroom with space for a home office and an art studio. She could afford it now. She could afford a lot of things. But what she treasured most wasn't the money or the stability or even the foundation's success. It was the knowledge that she'd been seen, truly seen, by someone who mattered. Margaret had looked at a lonely teenager and recognized something worth preserving, worth investing in, worth trusting with a legacy. And Sarah had proven worthy of that trust. As she unlocked her apartment door and stepped into the warmth and light of her own space, truly her own, paid for and secure, she made a silent promise to continue Margaret's work, to keep looking for the overlooked, the dismissed, the people nobody else wanted to invest in. Because sometimes the most valuable things are the ones nobody else wants. And sometimes the most worthless inheritances turn out to be the most precious gifts of all. The morning after the gallery opening, Sarah woke to 17 missed calls. Her phone had been on silent since the event, and now it buzzed insistently with messages, voicemails, and notifications that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. The first voicemail was from Richard Whitmore, Margaret's nephew. His voice dripped with false warmth. "Sarah, dear, it's Uncle Richard. We need to talk about this foundation you've started. There may have been some confusion about Aunt Margaret's assets. Call me back immediately." The second was from Constance, her tone sharper. "We've been speaking with our attorney. If you've discovered additional estate assets that weren't disclosed during probate, that's a serious legal matter. We expect full transparency." The third was Trevor, real slick cousin, pretending to be poor while sitting on nearly $1 million. "My lawyer says we have grounds to challenge this. Expect to hear from us." Sarah's hands trembled as she listened to the remaining messages, each one more threatening than the last. They'd seen the news coverage. They'd heard about the foundation, about the grants, about the money that had somehow materialized from nowhere. And now they wanted their share. She called Douglas Whitmore before she'd even made coffee. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady and calm. "I saw the coverage last night. Congratulations on the opening. I assume the family has been in touch?" 17 calls. "They're threatening to sue. Let them." Douglas's certainty was reassuring. Margaret structured those accounts specifically to avoid probate. The money was never part of her estate, which means they have no legal claim to it. "I've dealt with contested inheritances for 30 years, Miss Chen. This one isn't even close to questionable. But they're saying I hid assets, that there was fraud. There was no fraud. Margaret named you as beneficiary decades ago. She paid taxes on those accounts annually. Everything was properly documented and reported to the IRS. Your relatives are angry because they assumed Margaret had nothing left to give, and they're embarrassed that they overlooked something valuable." He paused. "Don't engage with them directly. Forward all their communications to me. If they want to waste money on lawyers, that's their choice. But they won't win. Sarah spent the rest of the morning doing exactly that, forwarding messages, blocking numbers, trying to focus on the foundation's work instead of the sudden onslaught of family hostility. But the calls kept coming, now from numbers she didn't recognize. Richard's attorney, Constance's financial advisor, even a private investigator asking questions about her relationship with Margaret. By noon, Sarah felt like she was drowning again, pulled back into the anxiety that had defined her life before the inheritance. She'd been foolish to think success would be simple, that she could just accept Margaret's gift and move forward without consequence. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Douglas, his voice urgent. "Don't go home." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What? Why?" "Richard filed an emergency petition this morning, claiming you coerced Margaret into changing her accounts. It's baseless, but a judge granted a temporary restraining order, allowing them to examine any documents you might have from Margaret's storage unit. They're at your apartment now with a court officer. They can, temporarily, until we fight it. But I don't want you there while they're searching. Can you go somewhere safe?" Sarah grabbed her laptop and purse, her mind racing. "I'm leaving now." "Good. Meet me at my office in an hour. We'll file a motion to dismiss, but we need to move fast." She drove to Douglas's office in a daze, checking her rearview mirror obsessively as if Richard's lawyers might be following her. This was insane. She'd done nothing wrong. Margaret had left her those accounts legally, deliberately, but money changed people, revealed the worst in them, and her relatives had always been more interested in wealth than family. Douglas's office was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around Sarah. He had papers already spread across his conference table, account statements, beneficiary designations, correspondence between Margaret and the investment firms dating back 25 years. "This is what we'll present to the judge," he said, pointing to the timeline he'd constructed. "Margaret established these accounts in 1998. She named you as beneficiary in 2003, when you were 16 years old, long before you had any contact with her as an adult. She confirmed the beneficiary designations in writing every 5 years, most recently in 2021. There's no coercion, no manipulation, no fraud." Then why did the judge grant the restraining order? Because Richard's attorney painted a compelling picture of a vulnerable elderly woman being taken advantage of by a distant relative who suddenly appeared near the end of her life. They claimed you must have known about the accounts, that you cultivated a relationship specifically to secure the inheritance. Sarah felt sick. "That's not what happened. I barely saw her after I was 15. I know, and we'll prove it. But judges err on the side of caution with elder abuse claims. The restraining order is temporary. It just allows them to examine any documents that might support their case." Douglas looked at her seriously. "Did you keep anything from the storage unit at your apartment?" Sarah's mind raced through the boxes she'd brought home. "Some photo albums, letters. Nothing financial, all of that is in the safety deposit box." "Good. Let them search. They won't find anything that supports their claim, because there's nothing to find." But as Sarah sat in Douglas's office, watching him prepare their defense, a new fear crept in. What if the judge believed Richard's story? What if the accounts were frozen during litigation? She'd already committed significant funds to the foundation, had granted money to artists who were depending on it. If everything was tied up in legal battles for months or years, what happens to the foundation? She asked quietly. Douglas looked up from his papers. "The foundation is a separate legal entity. They can't touch it. But if they freeze my personal accounts, they won't. I'll make sure of that." His expression softened. "Sarah, I've watched you over these past months. You've used Margaret's gift exactly as she hoped you would. You haven't bought mansions or luxury cars. You've lived modestly and helped others. When we go before the judge, that's the story we'll tell. Not one of manipulation and greed, but of generosity and purpose." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Richard and his team conducted what Douglas called a fishing expedition, searching Sarah's apartment, requesting bank records, interviewing anyone who might have information about her relationship with Margaret. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. But the process was humiliating. Sarah had to sit in a conference room while Richard's attorney peppered her with questions designed to make her look calculating and mercenary. Had she known Margaret was wealthy? Yes, she'd assumed so given the townhouse. Had she stayed in contact, hoping for an inheritance? No. She'd sent occasional Christmas cards out of politeness, nothing more. Had she asked Margaret about her finances? Never. The attorney showed her photos from the gallery opening, pointing to Sarah's professional dress and styled hair. You look quite prosperous for someone who claimed to be facing eviction. I used grant money to look professional at my foundation's first public event, Sarah replied evenly. The dress was from a thrift store. I did my own hair and makeup. Yet, just months earlier, you were supposedly destitute. I was, until Margaret's inheritance gave me stability. An inheritance you somehow knew about, despite it being hidden in a storage unit. I didn't know. I was as surprised as anyone. Round and round they went, the attorney trying to twist her words, to find some admission of wrongdoing. But there was none to find. Douglas, who sat beside her throughout the deposition, remained calm and professional, occasionally objecting to particularly aggressive questions. When it was over, he walked Sarah to her car. You did well, he said. They have nothing. Then why do I feel like I'm being punished? Because that's what legal harassment is designed to do, make you feel guilty even when you're innocent. Pressure you into settling just to make it stop. He squeezed her shoulder paternally. Don't give in. Margaret wanted you to have this. Fight for it. The hearing arrived. On a grey Thursday morning. Sarah dressed conservatively, simple black pants, white blouse, minimal jewelry, and met Douglas at the courthouse steps. Inside, Richard, Constance, and Trevor sat with their attorney, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who looked like she enjoyed battle. The judge, a middle-aged black woman with intelligent eyes and an air of no-nonsense authority, reviewed the briefs both sides had submitted. When she spoke, her voice was measured and clear. I've examined the evidence presented by both parties. Mr. Whitmore, your attorney claims that Miss Chen manipulated your aunt into naming her as beneficiary on several substantial accounts. But the evidence shows these beneficiary designations were made decades ago, confirmed multiple times, and documented in writing. Can you explain why your aunt would have made these arrangements so far in advance if she was being coerced? Richard's attorney stood. Your Honor, we believe Miss Chen cultivated a long-term relationship specifically to. Miss Chen was 16 when she was first named as beneficiary. The judge interrupted. Are you suggesting a teenager orchestrated a decades-long scheme to defraud an elderly woman? We believe the relationship was encouraged by whom? Miss Chen's mother, who died in 2015. This theory requires an extraordinary conspiracy spanning multiple generations. The judge turned to Douglas. Mr. Whitmore, you've presented documentation showing that Margaret Whitmore was of sound mind when she made these arrangements, that she confirmed them repeatedly, and that she took deliberate steps to keep these accounts separate from her probated estate. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Whitmore was a sophisticated investor who understood estate planning. She made these arrangements specifically to benefit Miss Chen outside of probate. The judge reviewed the papers before her one more time, then looked up. I'm dismissing the petition. The evidence clearly shows that Margaret Whitmore made deliberate, informed decisions about her assets. There's no indication of fraud, coercion, or undue influence. Miss Chen is the lawful beneficiary of these accounts. She turned to Richard and his family. Mr. Whitmore, I understand you're disappointed with your aunt's distribution of her estate, but disappointment is not grounds for litigation. Your aunt had the right to dispose of her property as she saw fit. This case is dismissed. The gavel came down with a crack. that felt like liberation. Richard's face flushed dark red. Constance looked like she'd swallowed poison. Trevor muttered something under his breath that Sarah was grateful she couldn't hear. Their attorney gathered her papers with tight, angry movements. As they filed out of the courtroom, Richard stopped beside Sarah. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Yes," Douglas said firmly, "it is. And if you continue to harass my client, we'll file for a restraining order and pursue damages for legal harassment. Your aunt made her wishes clear. Accept that and move on." Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood in the cool morning air and felt tears of relief stream down her face. Douglas handed her a handkerchief. "It's done," he said gently. "The inheritance is yours, legally and permanently. They can't challenge it again." "Thank you," Sarah managed. "I don't know how to thank you enough. Use Margaret's gift well." That's all the thanks needed. Over the following months, the foundation flourished. Without the shadow of litigation hanging over it, Sarah could focus entirely on its mission. She hired a part-time administrator, expanded the grant program, and began partnering with art schools to identify promising students who needed support. The applications that came in broke her heart and inspired her in equal measure. A young painter in Baltimore, whose supplies had been destroyed in an apartment fire. A sculptor in Minneapolis, who was caring for a disabled parent while trying to maintain her practice. A photographer in Phoenix, who'd been homeless for 6 months, but never stopped shooting. Each grant came with a personal note from Sarah, explaining Margaret's story and encouraging the recipients to pay the kindness forward when they could. Some wrote back immediately, their gratitude pouring out in emails and letters. Others disappeared into their work, emerging months later with exhibitions, publications, commissions. Sarah kept every thank you note in a leather-bound journal she'd bought specifically for that purpose. On difficult days, when the foundation's work felt overwhelming, she'd read through them and remember why it mattered. A year after the inheritance, Sarah received an unexpected call from Emily Torres, the artist she'd met at the gallery opening. Emily's voice was breathless with excitement. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Remember the Portland gallery that wanted to show my Urban Decay series? Of course. They sold 3 pieces, for real money more than I've made in my entire life. And the collector who bought them? She wants to commission a whole new series. She's offering enough that I can work full-time on my art for the next 2 years. Sarah felt a surge of pure joy. "Emily, that's incredible. It's because of you. Because your grant gave me time to finish the work, to show it professionally. I would have given up if you hadn't helped me." Emily's voice caught. "I want to donate back to the foundation. 10% of every sale from now on. It's not much, but it's everything," Sarah said softly. "It means the gift keeps moving forward." Emily's donation was the first of many. As grant recipients found success, several chose to give back, creating a sustainable cycle of support that extended far beyond Sarah's initial investment. The foundation was becoming something bigger than she'd imagined, not just a charity, but a community of artists helping artists, paying forward the kindness they'd received. One afternoon, as Sarah reviewed grant applications in her home office, she found herself thinking about the storage unit again, that ordinary orange door that had seemed so disappointing, so insulting. If she'd known what was inside from the beginning, would it have meant as much? She didn't think so. The journey mattered. The desperation that made her truly understand what she'd been given. The humiliation that taught her empathy for others in similar situations. Even the legal battle that forced her to defend Margaret's gift and truly claim it as her own. Margaret had understood that. She'd made Sarah work for the discovery, made her appreciate its value, made her worthy of receiving it. Sarah pulled out the brass key she still carried and held it up to the afternoon light. Such a small thing, such an enormous impact. Her phone buzzed with a text from Douglas Whitmore. "Thought you'd want to know. Richard lost his job. Constance is filing for divorce. Trevor's in rehab. The universe has a way of balancing scales. Sarah stared at the message, feeling not vindication but sadness. They'd had so much, the townhouse, the jewelry, the investments. But they'd been consumed by wanting more, by resentment over what they didn't get. Their greed had cost them everything that actually mattered. She typed back, "Thanks for letting me know. I hope they find peace." And she meant it, because Margaret's real gift hadn't been money. It had been the understanding that true wealth came from generosity, from purpose, from using what you had to lift others up. Sarah had learned that lesson. She hoped someday her relatives might learn it too. As evening fell, Sarah walked to the window and looked out over the city lights. Somewhere out there were artists working in cramped studios, students struggling to afford supplies, dreamers wondering if they should give up. Tomorrow, the foundation would announce another round of grants. More lives would change. More possibilities would open. All because an elderly woman had seen something worth nurturing in a lonely teenager, and had trusted her with a legacy that kept growing, kept giving, kept transforming lives with each passing day. Sarah pressed her hand against the cool glass and whispered into the gathering darkness, "I won't let you down, Aunt Margaret, I promise." And somewhere, somehow, she knew the old woman was smiling, pleased that her treasure so carefully hidden, so deliberately preserved, had found its way into exactly the right hands. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.